The Artist Way is a course in discovering and recovering your creative life.
Right.
And there are 12 different chapters, and they each focus on a different aspect of that. And to begin with, gardening comes up quite a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, so I thought that would be a good way to dive in. So in the big climax, it says this about gardening. Gardening is a hobby I often assign to creativity students. When someone is panicked halfway through across the bridge into a new life, repotting plants into larger and better containers quite literally grounds that person and gives him or her a sense of expansion. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think some of the things with gardening is when you're gardening, you're not doing anything else. So it's a physical thing, but your brain is free.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that then means that your brain can be just enjoying what you're doing, relaxing, and once you do all of those things, then more thoughts come in, more creative things come in. I used to find, not with gardening, but when I used to first go for my daily walk, I found on my daily walk was when I had any creative ideas.
Was that a surprise? So
It was a surprise.
You were taking the walk for exercise.
I was taking the walk for exercise, but that was the time when I think, because it was a basic thing, all you could do is walk.
Yeah.
Your head can be thinking totally different things.
Does my presence on the walk make that happen less?
This was way back when I was still working. So that was my time by myself. I think now I get a lot more time by myself. I haven't got the constricts of work or anything like that. So I have lots of time by myself. And so lots of other things give me that same time to think creatively.
Me neither, temporarily. So the walk has now become the connection.
Yes.
As opposed to the isolation time.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's really interesting because only slightly earlier she talks about both walking and the body. Walking is
it's a very physical. It's just
a physical thing.
Yeah, it's a purely physical, and your body does it without thinking.
Yeah, she has a distinction between the logic brain, which she says is related to survival, and the artist brain, which is where connections are made, patterns are discovered, and that's what we want to be connecting with. And a lot of the thinking that happens when we're not on the walk gets in the way of creativity.
Yeah.
The passage about walking here is in a subsection of recovering a sense of autonomy called the Zen of Sports. And she says most blocked creatives are cerebral beings. In order to effect a real recovery, because that's the whole thing is like about creative recovery.
Yeah, okay.
In order to effect a real recovery, one that lasts, we need to move out of the head and into the body of work. To do this, we must first of all move into the body. And she talks about yoga and meditation. We need enough energy to raise a strong signal. It's a metaphor that she uses. It's like you're sending out a signal to receive inspiration.
Right.
This is where walking comes in. What we are after here is a moving meditation. This means one where the act of motion puts us into the now and helps us to stop spinning. So that's crucial, that what you're just describing from your experience is in the penultimate chapter. We're working backwards.
Yes, yeah. Yeah. Well, I used to find as well that with the walking, and it does happen now, is that you start to absorb some of the things around you.
Yeah.
Because you're not distracted. You're not just trying to get somewhere. You're purely out to walk. So you start noticing trees or anything in nature, really. And a bit like we do now when we're out walking, you notice that there are changes in the seasons even. You notice new plants that are now flowering, all those sorts of things. And I think all of those things are quite calming. So that all helps. But it does make you just well, start noticing things. And actually noticing things is quite a big part of art, really. You've got to see things. So a bit like we had the conversation about the sea. You need to see and just notice those things, even if you don't actually do anything with it. It's just being aware of those things is all part of the walk for me.
And so you're talking there about the horizon line.
Yes, the changes that happen every day. Every day you look out there, it looks different. It's never just the sea and the sky. There are very big differences depending on the weather. And sometimes it will be very overcast and the sea will look really dark. And the sky might be looking brighter on the horizon because in the distance there is maybe sunlight. But above the actual sea you're looking at is dark. So you get those differences. And then in a different time of day or even another day or a different season, it's totally different. And sometimes the sea looks positively turquoise, say, because it's a lovely sunny day and the sky is blue and it's all beautiful.
Yeah, for me, I was wondering whether it might have something to do with kind of encapsulating the idea of where does one thing end and another thing begin. Like the boundary between the sky and the sea, and can you see it, and does it shift, and does it appear to be in one place and take one form at one moment? So that's what I was thinking before, but then now we have this idea of it being different on different days.
Yes.
So that seems to be a crucial component of it too.
Yeah, that's why I stop and look at it every day, because I know that it's not going to be the same. The walk is all of those things. It means I stop and I pause and I enjoy what there is around me.
Yeah.
Which you don't always do when you're just indoors somehow.
There's a chapter called Recovering a Sense of Abundance, which we'll turn to in that spirit in a moment. There's tasks at the end of each chapter to help you kind of get in the flow of that particular thing. And in the Recovering a Sense of Abundance chapter, one of the tasks is to go and pick 5 flowers to kind of recognize the beauty that there is. So I did this back in around Easter. And it was so funny the other day, I was looking back through the book and remembering that having an impact on me. And then we went on our walk, and without me sharing that, you wanted to show me
the garden,
the flowers in the garden, and you showed me 5 flowers.
All right.
Which was quite strange.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing that changes so much as well. The garden. I get so much pleasure from the garden, particularly this year. And we've been very lucky. We've had a lot of good weather this year, particularly early on when we were first in lockdown. The weather quite quickly turned into really good weather, so you could just spend time out in the garden, either just gardening or just absorbing the garden, just being amongst it. And that's just, I think, such a healing thing.
So before leaving the focus on the physical and walking and gardening, regarding swimming here, she says that rhythmic repetitive action transfers the locus of the brain's energies from the logic to the artist hemisphere. It is there that inspiration bubbles up, unchanneled by the constraints of logic. So do you have any reflections on the ways in which the logic brain might get in the way of the flow of creativity, or anything else in that passage there?
I can kind of understand exactly what they're saying, because for me the walking does the same thing. It's that repetitive process which just somehow frees other things up, really. It just does. And it was a surprise to me when I found that that's when I had the creative thoughts, because that wasn't ever part of the walk initially. So when I first started to do it, it was quite surprising to me that actually that's when I started to think about other creative things. Whereas really, this was just the walk I was doing first thing in the morning before I went to work to get a bit of exercise. I hadn't related it in any way as going to lead to creative thoughts.
Yes, presumably even if you were thinking you were doing gardening creatively, you weren't necessarily thinking this will make me more creative. This will help my creative projects.
No, not necessarily. No, I mean, the garden in a way is a creative project in its own right, because all the time, well, for me, I'm thinking to what plants will work together, what leaf shapes will work together, what colours will work together, when will they flower. So there's a lot of process involved, but it's also a very creative process, because all the time I'm thinking I want that area there to be pinks or yellows or whatever. You know, there's a structure to how I'm creating it. And the thing with the garden is, of course, a lot of it is beyond your control, really, because it does depend on weather, and whether not just physical weather, but whether the plant survives, how well it does. It might not like exactly
the weather and the weather.
Exactly, it might not like your conditions that you've given it. So there are lots of those things come into it. There's an element of risk as well. So you can't totally control that creative process. It's much more, you can guide it, but you can't necessarily control it.
Right.
And you get quite happy accidents sometimes because of that.
Unwelcome intrusions.
Possibly, yes. And, things that you wouldn't think would work together, suddenly you think, that actually works. I like that. That colour combination. So, because for me, a lot of my art is very influenced by colour. That's almost the determining factor in a way with my art. That's why I made quilts in a way, because they were very much determined by colour.
Colour, Line and Thread is an exhibition that you contributed to.
Yes. I suppose my part was in a way the thread, but
also the colour.
But also the colour. Yeah, it's very definitely colour that affects what I do.
For now, one more gardening image. She says, to use a gardening image, we must learn to not pull our ideas up by the roots to see if they are growing.
Okay.
You're talking about these surprises, these happy accidents, the fact of something different than you could have planned emerging.
Yeah.
Because you need to collaborate with the weather, the two weathers.
Yes, yeah.
Within this gardening metaphor, if you thought, let's do something crazy and see what happens if we put this splash of colour here, I would never think to put those flowers there, but maybe one's got there, and you think, well, let's actually see where that goes. You would, of course, mess it up if you tried to interfere.
Yes.
And think, I want to see whether this is working.
Yeah.
Does that gardening image there, we must learn to not pull our ideas up by the roots to see if they are growing, mean something to you?
I suppose the only way I could relate to that is by thinking that sometimes when you're working on some sort of art project and it doesn't seem to work, it's not necessarily a good idea to just discard it.
Yeah.
Even if you just put it to one side for something in the future, just discarding it is not a way forward. It could lead to something else at another time, and it may just be not now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's a whole chapter on that. This, recovering particular projects that you've just let die.
Yeah.
Returning to them and kind of resurrecting them. Younger artists as seedlings, their early work resembles thicket and underbrush, even weeds. This is about academia, actually, here.
Right.
And the fact that the academic context isn't one which generally nurtures creativity. Artists attempting to exist, grow, even flourish within that milieu recognize that the entire thrust of intellectualism runs counter to the creative impulse. The halls of academia, with their preference for lofty intellectual theorems, do little to support the life of the forest floor.
I'd be interested to know if you agree with that, because you were very much an academic, but you had a very creative side, with your art and your drawing and all of that.
These are two things that are very different, but not necessarily at odds.
No.
You know, and in this Into the Field project, I'm trying to, you know, integrate the two. You know, I'm returning to some of my academic interests. Like Spinoza is really important in it, which is what I've published scholarship on. But I think there is something about the academic milieu that is at odds with the creative flow, which is why I'm not that eager to jump back into being a professor.
Yeah, yeah.
An altered appreciation for the authenticity of growth for the sake of growth is not cultivated in that context. She says, in other words, as taller trees, let us not allow our darker critical powers unfettered play upon the seedling artists in our midst. That's her advice to authorities within the realm of academia, you know, who have like critical insights. In the chapter where she encourages picking flowers, another task she encourages is baking.
Right.
And then in this completely separate chapter, right at the end, Recovering a Sense of Faith, the final chapter, just after the idea of not pulling up ideas by the roots, she uses a baking metaphor. Hatching an idea is a lot like baking bread. An idea needs to rise. If you poke at it too much at the beginning, if you keep checking on it, it will never rise. A loaf of bread or a cake, baking, must stay for a good long time in the darkness and safety of the oven. As you're making your mincemeat for Christmas. And you do a lot of baking.
Yeah.
We've been watching the Great British Bake Off.
Yeah.
Does that image resonate? And not just the image, but the fact that you bake and you also garden and you also do creative work.
I'm not quite sure how I would link them.
Patience again.
Patience, yes, I can understand that, because yes, once you especially cakes, if you put them in the oven, you mustn't open the oven because they will sink, and the same with bread. So yeah, patience is very much a part of it, and yes, that definitely comes into gardening, because you've got to be patient, you've got to wait for things to grow. It doesn't just happen overnight.
Yeah.
Wait for seeds to germinate. You know, there's a lot of patience involved in that. I'm not so sure how I would use it with art in the same way. Patience. A lot of the art I do, because I do stitch, is in some ways I could relate it to walking, in that it's very methodical.
Repetition?
Yes, it's a very, gentle, slow, hand stitch in particular, very gentle, slow process.
Yeah.
And that process actually also frees up your mind. So the process of doing the art is also another creative thing, because it is so methodical that actually you can just do it without...
Kind of switches, it gives maybe the logic brain something to do.
Yes.
Keeps the logic brain happy.
Yes. But frees up the creative brain.
Because you might think, you've got a sewing machine just there. If you're conducting something that's more kind of crafty, more like a craft, like sewing, the repetition there, somebody might think, well, that's not going to lead to new discovery, but somehow it does.
I think particularly hand stitch does. I think machine stitch for me is very much more of a process in a way, with the quilts that I made. They were always quilted using a machine. I have done some hand quilting, but it's a very, very slow process. But the quilting on the machine is, and making a quilt, all of it is joined using a machine. It's all quite a fast process. So there's not the capacity, I don't think, as much for the creative thought, because all your energy is focused on matching everything and where you're going to do the line. Right. But it uses the logical brain as well, it very much. So the logical brain and the creative brain are all being used at the same time. There's no spare brain activity. But with the hand stitch, that's very different. And because it's a very slow process, it gives you lots of creative time to be thinking. And all the time you're working, you're thinking of other things, other ways of using what you're doing. So it's a very different thing.
I suppose you have more power to pause. If suddenly you have an insight, you can either pause,
Yeah.
or you can rush off and follow that intuition or whatever it is. With the machine, you're collaborating with a machine which is predetermined to do a certain thing.
I'm not sure it's it's predetermined to stitch.
Exactly.
But you are still very much in control of where it stitches and how it stitches. So, but because of that, you've got to concentrate a lot on that. So there is not much capacity left for anything else. And I'm not saying that it isn't a creative thing as well. Some of the work I've done on the machine is incredibly creative. I've stitched pictures that are just lots of machine stitch in varying colours to end up with an image. And that is very creative because all the time you're choosing the colour and how you're going to put it, and so that can be very creative. But it doesn't free up your brain to be creative in other ways at the same time. It's a creative process in itself, but it's not giving you the freedom to be thinking of something else as you're doing it.
Yeah, I like how you integrate some machine stitching into a project which involves this other type of creativity, perhaps more of the other type of creativity. Am I describing that correctly?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
You're relating to stuff at the end of The Artist's Way, so let's take a dive into the beginning.
Right.
It's called The Artist's Way, a spiritual path to higher creativity. Especially given how much you're relating to a lot of the stuff at the end, I'm interested in how much you can relate to her account of what creativity essentially is, which is what she'll begin with.
Right.
She claims that we are all creative. Through my own experience and that of countless others I have shared, I have come to believe that creativity is our true nature, that blocks are an unnatural thwarting of a process at once as normal and as miraculous as the blossoming of a flower at the end of a slender green stem. What do you think about that? Do you think we're all creative? And do you think that that process of the blossoming of a flower at the end of a slender green stem is both normal and miraculous?
Yes, and I think it gets blocked as you grow up on the whole, unless you move into a very creative environment. But for most people, it gets blocked because it doesn't fit in with the normal work or anything else. So people, it's probably why they choose gardening, because it's still a little element of being creative, or baking. There are ways of still being creative, but for lots of people, they lose the creative side because life takes over.
We were talking about the academia milieu before. She suggests that we all live in a milieu where a false belief that work has to be arduous is cultivated.
Yeah.
Whereas it's entirely possible, and she would argue natural, to experience an interplay of work and play. Kind of undoing the conditioning that leads us to have a disbelief in that possibility is one of the core things, the core components of discovering and recovering your creative self.
Yes, okay. I can see that makes sense, but I can also imagine that there are lots of workplaces where that just isn't possible. So in a way, it almost seems to me that if you happen to be intelligent and have got money, then the sort of work choice you can choose might enable you to be creative in it. But if you don't happen to have a really good education, so the job you get is very menial, or you work in a factory or something, then it would be very difficult to incorporate that.
Machines again. If you're working in the factory.
Yes, exactly. You've got to concentrate on the machine or you'll hurt yourself. Even with my sewing machine, if I'm not concentrating, I can sew my finger.
Yeah.
I've heard of people who've got their fingers stuck under the machine. So it depends on lots of things, and I think it's a lovely ideal, but I'm not sure everybody could go with that.
It's interesting though, because you're saying about a good education, but we've been recognising that the academic milieu can be precisely what works against discovering creative flow.
Yeah, well, there's a balance, isn't there, somewhere in the middle, I think.
Yeah. Is there any connection between learning that you experienced at school and your creativity in relation to between gardening and creativity? Because if there's more of a connection between the extracurricular, non-academic side of you and creativity, that would seem to suggest that schooling and formal education is not necessary to work and play creatively.
I think formal education is necessary to enable you to, well, for most people, to earn an income which enables you to have time to be creative. So I think the formal education is necessary, and I think sometimes it probably comes into what you're doing, because even with some of the stitching I do, if I'm making a quilt, a lot of that relies on very accurate measuring. So you could argue that some knowledge of maths and how numbers work is quite essential to be able to work that out. You need to use maths to work out that how many squares of this size do I need to cut to be able to produce the thing I want to produce? How much fabric am I going to use? So I think the formal education does come into a lot of things. I don't think you could not do that.
Well, that's the logic brain, like the cortex,
yes.
into the field, the part of the brain that relates to planning. Is related to the war table, where we sit down and we know things, and we make a plan. We know this is how things are, so therefore I will do this, and that does have an important role to play, even within creativity and within life. So, and within education, we can be more adept at using that part of the brain in a way that truly serves us. But it can also not serve us if it is too controlling.
Yes, I mean, I think when you're very young, you're allowed to make a mess with art, aren't you? But on the whole, the older you get, the less mess you make.
The less mess you're allowed to make.
Yes, and I think a lot of art courses encourage you to almost just play with the materials, to not expect an outcome, but to physically just play with the materials.
Because that process of play is crucial.
Yes. I think that's another issue. As you get older, you are very aware of the value of things. The fact that the paper you're using costs money. All the materials you use cost money. Therefore, you're much less willing to just play with them and possibly spoil them, because they've cost money and you've had to work hard to earn the money. Whereas when you're younger, that's not an issue. You're at school, probably you've been given things and you just make a mess, and money doesn't come into it at all. But it does start to come into it as you get older, and so you're much less willing to be free with the materials.
So on the one hand, an awareness of the monetary value of things might stop creativity.
Yes.
But on the other hand, an awareness of the monetary value of things will stop someone from becoming destitute.
Yes.
And it's less enjoyable to be creative if you're destitute.
Yes. Yes, because that doesn't feed you.
This all comes up in the Recovering a Sense of Abundance chapter, which is the one where she suggests tasks of baking and gardening at the end. Do you know the passage about the lilies of the field? There's like a biblical passage about the lilies of the field. You know, they just grow. They don't think about growing, and they're abundant.
Mm-hmm.
She says, for many of us, raised to believe that money is the real source of security, a dependence on God. She talks about God a fair amount. A dependence on God feels foolhardy, suicidal, even laughable. When we consider the lilies of the fields, we think they are quaint, too out of it for the modern world. We're the ones who keep clothes on our backs. We're the ones who buy the groceries. And we will pursue our art, we tell ourselves, when we have enough money to do it easily.
And time.
Money and time. And then we have, metaphorically, in the book Metaphors We Live By, we think about money and time using a lot of the same language and concepts. So spending time, I can't spend time on that. We talk about time as if it's money.
Yes. And for some people it is.
This chapter is called Recovering a Sense of Abundance. So if you have a sense of abundance, you think there's ample time and there's ample money.
Mm-hmm.
And then the opposite of abundance is scarcity. And then you think, but there might not be enough time actually. I better not decide to do this project. Or I can't afford it. So that's interesting, the scarcity mindset and abundance mindset. She has a whole chapter, which overspills into other chapters too. Mostly focused on how as an adult we might want to find ways that are not dangerous to reconnect with the inner child that isn't held back by the scarcity mindset.
Yeah.
The key tool that she's recommending to tap more into that abundance mindset in this chapter is reassessing and overhauling your God concept. And she thinks that a lot of people will have come from a certain type of religious background where they're told that certain things are sinful, which isn't an issue for you. When she's talking about God and recommending overhauling your God concept, suggesting perhaps that you might have an outdated concept of God as this authoritative male father figure who doesn't allow certain things to happen. Presumably that isn't the case for you.
It's definitely not a God thing, but it would definitely be something where it's taken me quite a long time to accept that if I want to get on and do some art, I can. That I don't have to do lots of work first to earn the option of being able to do it. And a lot of that comes from, I think, because you spend most of your life working, and then you get your leisure time. And that's almost the reward for the working. And even once I retired, it's still taken quite a while to accept that, well, now I don't have to go out and work to be able to reward myself with doing the art. But it is still the case for me that I do still get tied to almost the chores that need doing before I can free up and do the art. So I can't do the art until I've achieved the chores.
Is that because you want the environment to be conducive to...
Some of it is that, yeah. Some of it is that. Some of that is going back to the mental side. If I know there are lots of chores to be done, that will impact on my brain enough that I can't be creative anyway, because that will all be milling around in my head as these things need doing. You can't possibly relax and do these other creative things. Exactly, you don't deserve to. And I know that John has a very different mindset. For him, if something creative comes into his head, he will do it there and then. He won't have any concerns about the chores that need doing first. So we work very differently.
I'm like you with doing the chores first. That's not true.
No, I know. No, you're like your father.
In that respect, yeah.
Yeah, but and that's just, that's something it's taken me quite a long time to battle, and even now it is still a bit of a battle. I could never just throw myself totally into being creative, even if there's a big project and I want to get on with that project. If there are other chores that need doing, keeping on top of the washing, the housework, working out what we're going to eat, all of those things would all impact on whether or not I could just throw myself into that project.
Yeah. Whereas obviously having things be in order is good. So long as you are determining what the order is.
Yes.
And so long as it serves you to have things in order.
Yes.
And so it doesn't become an obsession.
I can't work in a messy environment, so I would have to tidy my environment to be able to work as well. And there again, that's why I very, very much from Dad, because he can work on top of a pile of papers, and I can't. I'd have to clear all the papers first.
Yeah.
But I wonder as well how much of it is based on being female rather than male, because I think as a woman there's still the feeling that really I'm responsible for when the washing gets done, I'm responsible for whether or not the house gets cleaned, whether or not we've got food in the house, what we're going to eat so that we eat the right food to keep us healthy. All of those things I would still feel are kind of my responsibility.
These are ideas that are in your subconscious or conscious mind.
Yes.
And whether or not you fully agree with the idea that just by virtue of being female, it falls to you to do all those things. You seem to be suggesting that in your mind there is the idea, whether or not you choose it, that as a woman you need to do those things.
And even if you don't personally do it, even if I'm going to delegate some of these things, I've still got to have worked out who I'm going to delegate them to and when and how.
And that's labour too.
It's still kind of my responsibility to have done that. And a part of that is I feel as if I haven't delegated that specifically, then it won't happen.
Right. So that's a lot of energy then is caught up in all of that.
Yeah. Nothing to do with art really, but yeah.
It has a lot to do with your creative life, and again back to the idea of the blocks and the flow.
Yeah.
It seems fair to kind of categorize those ideas that get in the way of I need to do these roles that the woman needs to do, or I need to delegate because otherwise I am the person that would otherwise be doing these things and no one will do them otherwise.
Yeah.
That blocks a lot of the energy. What could otherwise be channeled into art?
Yeah, I think that's much less of an issue now that I'm retired, because you have so much more time. So therefore, yes, those things are still there, but they can fit in, and you still have time left to be creative. So that makes a huge difference.
Is that situation infuriating, though, sometimes?
I'm not sure they were ever infuriating. No, they were just an acceptance of that's the way it is, really. I don't think I ever really felt this was a terrible thing or anything. So no.
Okay. Well, back to the idea of order.
Mm-hmm.
So you like things to be orderly.
Yeah.
What she says in the opening pages of the introduction is when the word God is used in these pages, you may substitute, you may want to do this, the thought good, orderly direction.
Yeah.
Or flow.
Yeah.
Because it's like an acronym. God.
Yeah.
Good, orderly direction.
Okay.
So maybe you take that advice as someone who likes order and who doesn't believe in God.
Yes.
Then you do believe maybe in good, orderly flow.
Yes. Yeah.
And she says just try using it. By the simple scientific approach of experimentation and observation, a workable connection with the flow of good, orderly direction, aka God, can easily be established. What do you think of that sentence?
I'm a bit confused by that sentence.
So she's saying people who do believe in God, insofar as it relates to an actual thing that perhaps you can relate to as well, we can call it good orderly direction or flow. And there are certain tools that can be used and practices that can be cultivated that will deepen and enrich the connection with this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just a state of mind, the good orderly flow, the good orderly direction state of mind, where your love of order and your need to have things be in order stops being a block and becomes something which enables.
It definitely does enable me, yes. I mean, you only have to look at my shelves over there that are all very ordered. There are different fabrics in different boxes, there are different wools in different boxes. I've got a cupboard there that's full of things that are all very organised.
Yeah.
All of my materials are very organised, so although it looks a bit of a muddle, and all my art and my brushes and things are together, it is all very ordered, because without that order, for a start, just the very practical thing, I wouldn't be able to find anything that I needed to include in this creative process. So there's got to be order for me, because there are just so many materials involved in the sort of art I do.
Yeah.
Whether that's paint or pencils or fabric or thread. If they're not ordered, I wouldn't be able to use any of them almost. So there does need to be a lot of order in that for me.
So you have, well, I'll get some footage of this later. But so here you have order that you have created.
Yes.
And then when you go on your walks or when you're gardening and you're having to let things be a bit and you're responding to things that you're not expecting and you're acknowledging the virtue of that, that becomes something that you're seeking and enjoying there. What's the relationship or the difference between the order that you have created and the good orderly direction or flow that you experience, say, when you're gardening or when you're walking?
That's a difficult one.
Because they're both order.
Yeah, I can't relate it to the walking. With the gardening, there is still order, quite a lot of order in my gardening practice as well, because there again I have to have, that's why I've got a potting shed now. I have to have an orderly place for things to enable me to be creative in the garden. So the order definitely comes into it in the gardening aspect.
So Julia Cameron says, the success of a creative recovery hinges on our ability to move out of the head and into action. This brings us squarely to risk. Most of us are practiced at talking ourselves out of risk. We are skilled speculators on the probable pain of self-exposure. What do you think about that passage?
I think when I was first doing art that was then going to go into exhibitions, there was very definitely risk involved, because I thought, what if people don't like these things? What if they think this isn't very good? So there was definitely that element of risk there, and it took a while for me to be kind of brave enough to do it. And then once you do and you start getting some positive feedback, even if other people don't like it, if you've had some positive feedback, then you kind of think, okay, I can take this risk again, really, I can do more of this.
This is exactly what that chapter's about. She says, perfectionism is a refusal to let yourself move ahead. It is a loop, an obsessive, debilitating closed system that causes you to get stuck in the details of what you were writing or painting or making and to lose sight of the whole. And then, in order to risk, we must jettison our accepted limits. Which develops into, there is something enlivening about expanding our self-definition, and a risk does exactly that. Selecting a challenge and meeting it creates a sense of self-empowerment that becomes the ground for further successful challenges. How does that relate maybe to having an experience of completing one of the activities that are set in the group, or going through with exhibiting some work for the first time?
Going back to this idea of using up valuable materials, you could argue there's an element of risk there in that, these are precious papers or whatever that I've just torn out of there and made into a book, say.
What a waste.
Exactly, yeah. So, there is that element of risk, you could argue.
Yeah, that brings us back to scarcity thinking. I was using that word before, with scarcity and there's abundance. There's a chapter called Recovering a Sense of Possibility, which is about exploring how you curtail your own possibilities by placing limits on the good you can receive. You will examine the cost of settling for appearing good instead of being authentic, no longer ruling out your growth by making others the cause of your constriction. This is where she focuses most explicitly on clearing away the wreckage of our negative patterning, clarifying the vision of what it is we want, learning to accept small pieces of that vision from whatever sources, and then one day, presto, the vision seems to be suddenly in place. First of all, we must believe that we are allowed to catch the bus. Everyone has equal access. Since everyone can draw on the universal supply of the good orderly direction and flow, we deprive no one with our abundance. If we learn to think of receiving God's good as being an act of worship, we can begin to let go of having to sabotage ourselves. So there's this sense that what you're experiencing when you're on the walk, that's something which is open to everyone. And it's more a case of removing what gets in the way of those moments. That costs no money.
Yeah.
What strikes me as interesting here is that then she uses lots of water imagery, which kind of relates to us
Yes.
looking at the channels.
Yeah.
There's a section called Finding the River, in a sense that there's like a spring within, effectively. Within each of us, there is something which wants to flow, and that would naturally flow in just like that water does, if the trappings of modern life, which are explored in the news book, are recognised and stripped away. Does that relate?
Yeah, and going back to the walk and you saying that that's available to anybody, that it is, but even that comes down to whether you can give that sort of time to just being and looking.
Can you afford to?
Yes, because if you're a busy working mother, you probably rush in from work and you've got to feed your children, and then you can't go out because you've got to look after your children. And so actually time becomes a very precious thing. And I think for a lot of people, they don't actually have the time to be able to do that because they've got too much other responsibilities. They're a carer, or they're just working long hours. They're exhausted when they get home. So although in principle everybody has got that option, I think in reality they don't actually have that option.
A lot of focus throughout this book is on being very, very clear first and foremost with yourself about the importance of finding time. So on the one hand, she's saying recovery is the process of finding the river and saying yes to its flow, rapids and all. So if you have this moment when you're on the walk, or when you're meditating, or when you're gardening, where you feel moving into the flow, then if you recognize and work with that, then it will go somewhere. But there will be resistance to it for all kinds of reasons, and she has tools for overcoming that resistance. And there are two main tools. They're maybe not what you would expect. The basic tools is the name of this section.
Okay.
The two tools are called morning pages and the artist date. And she says, think of this combination of tools in terms of a radio receiver and transmitter. It is a two-step, two-directional process, out and then in. Doing your morning pages, you are sending, notifying yourself in the universe of your dreams, dissatisfactions, hopes. Doing your artist date, you are receiving, opening yourself to insight, inspiration, guidance. Now I can explain a bit more about what those two tools are. First thing that you do after getting out of bed, before your brain is able to get into kind of planning mode, when you're
daily routine mode.
Yeah, it reminds me of the image of the citizens sleeping, creating the reality of the nation. And the idea is, okay, once you emerge from your dreams, the first thing that you do is write. Not necessarily if you're a writer. If your art is purely visual art, if you're just working with fabrics, if you have no intention to write a poem or anything in your life, still, one of the two tools that were referred to throughout the book is first thing you do when you get out of bed, you just write for 3 pages. And whatever's in your mind, or whatever's within, just flows out onto the page. Does it seem strange that that would be presented as a tool, as one of 2 fundamental tools to enable discovery and recovery of your creative self?
No, it doesn't seem strange, because, as you say, it's before the routine of the day and the mundanity of life almost has taken over. It's when your brain is still probably half dreaming almost. So no, that all makes sense, but I still don't think it's possible for everybody to do it.
To make time for it.
No, because if you, and I go back to being a mother, if you've got very young children, they've probably come in and woken you up. There's no way that you've then got time to go and do something else. They are there and they need attention straight away. And in some ways, even if you think, well, okay, I'll wake up a bit earlier than that.
Which is the idea.
You probably aren't going to manage to do that because you are so tired from managing life and children and work that you need the sleep more than you need that. So actually, that may not happen because you are always going to be exhausted. So I think talking from the perspective of a mother and knowing how exhausting it was, especially when children are very young, it's almost a permanent exhaustion. So the idea of anything else is just impossible. And it's only really now, as I've got older and there aren't all the other pressures, that I feel as if I've got time to in any way really be creative. And I won't say that's only since I've retired. It was probably since, family moves away, grow up and don't need you in the same way, and you start to then determine for yourself what your life is a bit more. It's not geared by what other people's needs are, I suppose. But I think it is quite relevant for mothers in particular, because so much of their life will be geared to what does my family need. That's just the way. It's almost impossible to breathe that out of you. I think it doesn't matter how much you get equality between sexes. Somehow I think inbuilt in that whole thing is this, the need to be a mother, the need to be responsible for the family. But going back to this idea of tools to help you be creative, I think there are definitely tools that help you be creative. And before now we've talked, not us, but as artists, we've talked about the blank page. And the way to avoid the blank page is maybe just to actually go through a sketchbook and put some colour on the pages. Because immediately then you haven't got a blank page. So then when you want to approach doing something, you've got something there. Even if you then totally cover that up, there is something there to stop it being the blank page. Because I'm sure for writers and any artist, the blank page is the difficult bit. And totally in a non-artistic way, when I was studying to do bookkeeping, and I had to there were exams I needed to pass, and you'd be given the exams. What I always did initially was almost rewrite the question, because I found just rewriting the question took away the blankness of I had to now put the answer down. And it was just the process of I've started. So I think the most important thing is you've got to start.
Stepping out.
Yes, it's that start. And it doesn't matter what the start is. It can be totally irrelevant to what you end up doing. It's just you've got to make the start.
Yeah, because we are always in process anyway, so to some extent the idea of creating something from nothing is an illusion. So to do something to counter that illusion, so that the page already has a bit of character in this splash of colour.
Yes, and you could argue that's what this sketchbook does. It has things on the pages initially, which mean they are no longer blank pages.
Yeah.
So therefore whatever else goes on that page, it's already got a starting point.
If we do commit to ourselves enough to do these things, okay, so the morning pages takes, 20 minutes, and there'll be all kinds of reasons for different individuals why they would think, I can't do that, I don't have the time. But she's saying, if you value your creative life and well-being highly enough, there will definitely be a harvest. And she's suggesting that, this process, to have a life of higher creativity, a joyful life, where there are more moments of being in the flow, and you enjoy the good orderly direction, then the key thing to do is to remove the blocks. And the key way to remove the blocks is to get the thoughts down. And the more raw and unpalatable and unshareable and private the morning pages are, then the more useful they are to enable a sense of connection with those shadow parts, effectively, of the self. So the person who, let's imagine someone a single mother who has 4 kids and 3 jobs, and they somehow managed to make time for the morning pages, and the morning pages are just full of complaint about that, then they would find a way. That would be great.
Well, that will have automatically released a lot of tension, if nothing else, just writing things down.
Yeah, and so there's no longer a denial of those aspects of the self. There is a sense of valuing the self and valuing the needs of the self through making that time against the odds. And there is the possibility of going back and excavating those nodes for what the truest needs are and what the most legitimate complaints are, and maybe against one of these thoughts in the subconscious mind, I just have this responsibility to do this thing. If there's a recurring valid complaint that's coming up, then there might be a recalibration of these thoughts. And so this mother who, let's imagine she's a textile artist, so the last thing she's thinking when she reads this book is, given that she has 4 kids and 3 jobs and is a textile artist, she's not going to make time for 20 minutes of writing every morning. But the idea is that the morning pages, again, they are the transmitter, notifying yourself and the universe of your dreams, not just your dreams, though, your dissatisfactions and your hopes. And whatever flows out, even if it seems unfriendly, is necessary. So there's that. And then the artist date is just taking yourself on a date the only stipulation really is that it's just you. Time allocated to be just yours. And just like the morning pages are not supposed to lead to the great creative work, the artist state also is preparing the soil again.
As I was saying earlier about this idea of just playing with your materials, it's just setting aside some time when there is no expectation of what you're going to achieve. You are purely there to spend time playing with the things that you've got.
A sentence that is particularly relevant, I think, to this current project that I have, that I'm interested in seeing how you and Dad respond to, is this: art is the imagination at play in the field of time. Let yourself play. That's the final couple of sentences in the introductory section on the basic tools. Art is the imagination at play in the field of time. We were talking about time. What you get is now no tomorrow. If you fall in the fame trap.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Art is the imagination at play in the field of time.
Yeah, I can kind of get what that's saying, because art, in a purely practical sense, does use a lot of time, and you do have to be prepared to just give it quite a bit of time, I think. And then that does allow the imagination to kind of take over, because the more time you've got that you can give it, almost, a bit like when I started working on this book, I didn't actually know how I was going to decorate it, so I just started by doing the things that I'd seen her do in the workshop. She had got a few ideas, and once you start doing that, then actually your imagination comes into it, more ideas come. But it is allowing yourself the time to just do that and just let it happen, almost.
Yeah, giving yourself the gift of time.
Yes.
She is quite insistent that anyone can find the time for the morning pages and for the artist state, and that, you know, if you're going to recover, she uses that framework throughout, then that's the practice. These are the tools. In the introduction to The Artist's Way, she's inviting readers to take certain things that she's saying on faith, give it a try, and see where it goes. And so you have experience, because you do have free time now.
Yep.
To go for walks, and you do have this space where you can be creative. And you've described moments like being on the walk where you're suddenly struck by something beyond you that inspires you, looking out to the sea, for example, or noticing trees. And so she's suggesting, okay, that's a thing that everyone can access. And some people call it God. If you're resistant to calling it God, then it's good, orderly direction or flow. And there are certain practices that can maximize your experience, your receptivity to those kinds of moments. And so she says, do these things and a breakthrough will follow, whether you believe it or not, whether you call it a spiritual awakening or not.
Yeah.
So I've just tried to describe in terms that draw on your experience what she is claiming is true about reality, whereas all essentially created beings, we all, in our natural state, experience this flow and can be channels for this creative energy, and it's just a matter of removing the blocks. And two tools for removing the blocks are the morning pages and the artist state, and then here are 12 chapters that you can work through, each of which is a different way of discovering and recovering the creative self beneath the blocks.
Mm-hmm.
She says, do these things and a breakthrough will follow. In short, the theory doesn't matter as much as the practice itself does. It doesn't matter whether you call it God. It doesn't matter whether you think it's a spiritual awakening. But if you do these things, then results will occur that could be described in those ways.
Yeah.
What you are doing is creating pathways in your consciousness through which the creative forces can operate. Once you agree to clearing these pathways, your creativity emerges. In a sense, your creativity is like your blood. Just as blood is a fact of your physical body and nothing you invented, creativity is a fact of your spiritual body and nothing that you must invent. To what extent does that relate to your experiences? To what extent are you resistant to it being described in that way?
I probably am slightly resistant to it being described in that way. But I can definitely see the benefit of, in particular, the walk. You know, let's talk about the walk or the garden. I can definitely feel that those two things, either working in the garden or just even sitting in the garden or going for my walk, very definitely help my mental state and free up my head to be more creative. So definitely I can see that aspect of it. If I'm not, I mean, I've noticed the difference even in the few weeks that we've been going for our walk, how much better I feel on lots of different levels.
Had you not been going for your walk?
No, it's only since we started to do it together. The only reason I started doing it again, I used to do it before I took up tennis, but then I took up tennis, so I was getting some exercise and getting outside. But for me, I'm very much an indoors person. John is very much an outdoors person. I'm very much an indoors person. So I almost need to be kind of dragged out there. I'm very much a fair weather gardener. I enjoy the gardening, but only if the weather's nice. You know, if it's miserable or cold, you won't find me gardening. So I have to have a reason to be going out there. And
so I'm like your accountability buddy for walking.
Yes, and the walk, going back to time constraints as well, would be another one of those things where you think, I'm not sure I've really got time for a walk today, I should be doing so and so. But I've worked out the benefits outweigh the time that it takes. And they're again on lots of levels. One is we get time to spend time together, which is particularly nice. And if we're not doing a great deal, it's just nice to spend that time together. The fresh air is particularly good for me. I'm much more likely to go for my walk, even if the weather's a bit miserable, than I ever would be to go outside. So just being outside is in itself good. I'm getting fresh air, I'm getting exercise, all of which I think helps my head. I'm being a part of the community much more than I ever would by just going out for that walk. You know, we bump into neighbours, we have a chat.
Yeah.
All of those
Lynn and
things.
Ernie always, in a strange way, Lynn and Ernie are always walking up the hill as we're walking down it, no matter what time it is.
Yes.
And then they introduce us, as they did today, to new people.
Yeah, or else they're outside painting the fence. And in summer they tend to have their front door open. So quite often if you walk past, they're around, you know, and you can say hello. So the community aspect is particularly helpful for me. You know, it's another bit of my well-being. So all of these things are impacting on my mental health, I think it's fair to say.
You said about freeing up the mind.
Yes.
And so a scientific way to describe that would be to focus on neuroplasticity. You know, she says you're creating pathways in your consciousness. I imagine that way of describing things you're more receptive to that way of describing things.
Yes.
Because there's a scientific explanation.
Yeah.
You know, we have certain neural pathways.
Yeah.
But neuroplasticity is a term used to describe how the plasticity
Yeah.
of those pathways.
Yeah.
They can become more like the channels that we observe when we're on our walks and we look down at the sea and we see those channels. They determine their own motion.
Yes.
And so the pathways in our mind can become more like that if we open ourselves to different kinds of experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the very physical thing of walking is your heart's pumping oxygen to your brain. So on a very physical level, that's got to be helping.
Yeah.
If you're just doing nothing, there's nothing stimulating the brain. And I feel as if the oxygen is stimulating the brain. So for me, it's all a positive thing.
Yeah.
And in the summer, just spending time outside in the garden, just sitting, absorbing the garden for me, that is almost like a spiritual thing.
So you are comfortable using the term spiritual in relation to being in the garden?
Yes, it is it's the place where I can be very happy, just absorbing all the things, the colours of the flowers, maybe the perfume of the flowers, the way things are moving in the breeze, the bees buzzing, all of those things are all quite important parts of the garden.
How significant is the sense of awareness of having played a role in its creation without having controlled it?
I think that's a very important part. I can look at this and going back to the idea of the work ethic almost, there has been a lot of work involved to get this to this point, and now I can enjoy it. The work doesn't stop with the garden because there's always more things to be done. But you've worked for this pleasurable moment almost.
Yeah. She uses the metaphor of shaking an apple tree and oranges come out. So she says if you use the practices that she encourages, which enable this freeing of the mind due to neuroplasticity, there'll be fruition in a different form than you're expecting. And the red grass, I think, exemplifies that. So you put lots of work into the garden, but at no point when you were putting the work into the garden were you thinking, I want to have the experience of seeing red grass out the kitchen window.
Yeah, because the sun's shining on it, yeah.
But then it kind of comes up in that way.
Yes.
And and speaking of the walking, the next 3 weeks of the Into the Field videos are, first of all, Lynn sharing her poetry. And she'll read one of the poems in your garden because she thought that was the ideal setting to celebrate this bulb blossoming. And then 2 weeks of me walking. I'd have one walk on my own, but inspired by your observations of the channels. So then I go down to investigate that. And then the following week, we go for a walk to buy some bread, and that's a whole week's worth of videos. When you see that, you'll see why. There are various things happen on the walk, different locations like the church, for example, that are perfect scenes to explore different themes. In response to skepticism about her way of describing things, if someone were to say, oh, it's just freeing the mind, it's just neuroplasticity, she would point to strange things that happen, like, for example, always running into Lynn and Ernie, and just at the right time for them to introduce you to someone else, or being in the right place at the right time, to see something that inspires a big project. She calls that synchronicity, the triggering of synchronicity. And she claims that if you apply her methods, then you'll start experiencing these weird synchronicities that can't be explained by just the neuroplasticity explanation. A section that I definitely wanted to discuss with you is the one called Fame,
Right.
because of your book.
Yeah.
Fame is not the same as success, and in our true souls we know that. We know and have felt success at the end of a good day's work. But fame, it is addictive and always leaves us hungry. We all like credit where credit is due. As artists, we don't always get it. Yet focusing on fame, on whether we are getting enough, creates a continual feeling of lack. And she says more about fame, but how much are you relating to what she's saying about that, and how much does it seem right and natural that she's focusing on fame in a book on recovering your sense of creativity?
I'm not sure I would associate fame with art. For most artists, fame is irrelevant. That's not something. That's not why they do art.
It's one of the big blocks, she's saying, that we need to remove. To be able to have the God experience, the good orderly direction of flow. There are multiple different ways in which we can be stuck. And focus on trying to become famous is one of these ways, a prevalent way in our society. It's so much in the milieu, wanting to be, to receive external validation and to be seen to be successful. You know, we're all to some extent affected by that. It's like a virus.
Yeah.
She says, when you have been toxified by the fame drug, you need to detox by coddling yourself and giving yourself that recognition, that validation from within. It's very related to competition, and she quotes Krishnamurti, real learning comes about when the competitive spirit has ceased. So of course if we want to be famous, that's just related to where we stand within a society. And that's very much at odds with this sense of connection. The creative life is between you and the universe, or what she calls God, but in a not theological sense. This flow state.
When she talks about being famous, does she actually mean commercially successful as an artist? Because that's an issue that for some people, if what they're choosing as their career is being an artist, then they also have to be commercially successful.
And they become famous for a particular style. And she writes about how if you have the sense that your heart's not in that style anymore, but that's what you're famous for, then that could be the challenge to do something which is not commercially viable, but she calls this in a good way spiritual dependency. So rather than being dependent on the market and other people's tastes and so on, if you choose to be dependent instead on whatever it is that is responsible for those experiences that you have on your walks and when gardening, have faith in that and trust that and have the commitment be to that, she claims that there will be rich rewards, which may come in the form of money. Once you, maybe through doing the morning pages, get to the point where you realize there's an either-or choice. If you choose against that, then there won't be real riches. Does all that make sense, even without, with your resistance to her spiritual framework?
Yes, it all makes sense, but I think there again, it comes with almost a warning, because there again, if you are an artist and that is how you make your living, then if you've been making a living as an artist, it can be quite difficult to decide, well, this doesn't really work for me anymore, I'll do something different, because that might mean you've got no income.
Yeah.
And then you might have to get a job, and then you haven't got the time to be the artist. So it's not a straightforward thing, I don't think. And I think there are different types of artists. There are the artists who I consider in some ways to be real artists, who the work is the important thing. But they can probably afford to be able to be like that because they've got some income from somewhere else. But for a lot of artists, they've got to be able to make an income. So therefore what they might choose to do is a very commercial thing, because that's what will keep them alive, basically.
Yeah.
That's what will pay their rent and buy them food.
I suppose Cameron would maybe, Julia Cameron here, would maybe just say, well, if someone is doing that and they're fully aware that they're doing that and they're making time for themselves to do something which is more...
that fulfills that other need, that creative...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because then that's okay. So long as there's awareness of it. She says, the only cure for the fame drug is creative endeavour. Only when we are being joyfully creative can we release the obsession with others and how they are doing. Do you think Bowie achieves that?
Yes. I mean, it's difficult to know how he felt about what other people thought about what he did. But he was very good at just totally changing direction. You know, when that creative flow had finished on one thing, he would just move on to something else. And so I think he is a good example of how you keep those creative things going.
Taking risks.
Yes.
Back to risk again. And paradoxically, it's by taking those risks and doing something which might alienate some of the previous audience that disaster is averted. Rather than risk-taking leading to disaster. Does that make sense? The possibility of disaster being averted by means of risk-taking.
Yes, because you can get very stale in what you're doing, and if it's all been done before, eventually your audience, whatever that audience is, will have tired of it and moved on.
Yeah.
So, yes, that does make sense.
Yeah. She uses the word kriya in a chapter on recovering a sense of integrity. And I know the word kriya from Kriya Yoga. Kriya, though, is a Sanskrit word meaning a spiritual emergency or surrender. And she suggests that it's through these kriya moments where it's almost like the phoenix, alive, one chapter ends, and then from the ashes, because of that fire, a new phoenix emerges. These surrenders, the letting go that happens. And again, she's talking about this in the context of the morning pages. She says, over any considerable period of time, the morning pages perform spiritual chiropractic, which is a term she uses a few times.
Right.
They realign our values. If we are to the left or to the right of our personal truth, the pages will point out the need for a course adjustment. We will become aware of our drift and correct it. If only to hush the pages up. Because it's like a mirror that's held before us. And she says, when you don't feel creative, when you're exhausted, you might, the pages are the last thing that you want to do. But that's the best time to do them, because then, so long as you force yourself to write, and write stuff you don't want to write, then there's no avoiding the thing that is the block. And, for some people the block could be obsession with fame. But for other people, the block could be a sense of ideas about responsibility, which might be very well founded, but in an unconscious way, all wrapped up with some valid ideas. There might be some ideas that don't serve the person as well, and then they're given a chance to emerge from the morning pages. And then she says, one last gardening metaphor. One of the clearest signs that something healthy is afoot in this process is the impulse to weed out things. So you might find yourself all of a sudden wanting to change the room, or get rid of something to make, and you can't really fully explain why it is. You just feel compelled to do it. The only reason why we need these practices, these methods, is because the only obstacle to the flow are the blocks. And so becoming aware of the blocks is all that needs to happen.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks to the morning pages, we learn what we want and ultimately become willing to make the changes needed to get it. But not without a tantrum and not without a kriya. He says, not without this kind of crisis. And she uses the analogy of the 12-step program. This is about creative recovery.
Yeah.
So it's like recovery, like an alcoholic might be in recovery.
Yeah.
And naming one's poison. So if you're an alcoholic, maybe it's easy. Alcohol. But she suggests that none of us are perpetually in the flow state. And most of us have some experience of something like what she calls God, the good orderly direction, what you've been experiencing. And given that we're none of us always in that state, all of us have some blocks. And here are some methods to remove the blocks. Related to the taking a step, you were talking about taking a step both literally with walking and like stepping out into a project, thinking I'm going to create something for this exhibition despite the self-doubt. She says, it is my experience both as an artist and as a teacher that when we move out on faith into the act of creation, the universe is able to advance. It is a little like opening the gate at the top of a field irrigation system. Once we remove the blocks, the flow moves in. So that's a passage which is really nice for me in terms of into the field. And given how much a lot of what she's saying is resonating, I wonder whether you might be encouraged to take a step with trying out the practice of the morning pages.
I can't imagine me doing that, purely because words are not something I'm good at. I struggle with language, finding the right words, using the right word, all of that. And I know that's irrelevant to this project in a way.
Because you're not meant to show it to anyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think I kind of steer clear of words. So that in itself would be the challenge. The fact that I've got to write something down.
Yeah.
And I've got no idea what I would write. When I wake up in the morning, I'm not sure that I have any thoughts that are relevant or even irrelevant in terms of what I would write. I would really struggle with that.
She would encourage you to write about that.
Maybe, yeah. But that would get boring after some days.
Yeah, and so then it might have emerged into something else. She suggests, the flow of consciousness, like in Virginia Woolf, in certain aspects of Virginia Woolf's writing, there might be flow of consciousness. And in that context, we don't have properly constructed sentences. It's just flow. And sometimes there might be particularly poetic, beautiful flow, which would be, if someone's medium is writing, that would be like being in the flow.
Yeah.
Being a channel for creativity. But the writer who has moments of doing that is not in that state most of the time. And she's suggesting that getting in the habit of just having thoughts flow in a grammatically incorrect way that no one else will see and then being aware of that channel and noticing where there's blocks and resistance and knowing that the blocks are there anyway, and the blocks annoy us anyway,
Mm.
but seeing them and then thinking, and then thinking, okay, that's a block, and seeing what tools there are to remove that block.
Mm.
You know, it's more about creative living and the joy of playing in the field of time
Mm.
than it is about writing lots of stories.
Yeah, yeah.
Or creating lots of art. So, yeah, morning pages she thinks is the tool. So if ever you want to give it a try, I would encourage you to step out on faith and see what happens.
Okay.
See whether there are more weird synchronicities. Because there seem to be more, even just by going on walks.
Mm.
But going on walks and gardening, you know, those are already methods that you're doing.
Mm.
And the artist state is something else that, you know, is the other primary tool that's encouraged. So if you want to give that a try, it's just knowing on a certain day, at a certain time, you will do a certain thing. Maybe it's watch a movie, but it's, no matter what happens, you'll do it, and it's just you.
Mm.
It's basically, you were talking about growing up, and, you know, we get out of the flow when we grow up.
Mm.
It's recognizing that the inner child, the artist is the inner child.
Mm.
So you have to treat it.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Give your inner child treats.
Oh, I just realised it's gone up again.
Oh, that's okay. So yeah, that's my challenge, if you choose to accept it, is to take any of the tools that she's described
Mm.
and give them a go and see what happens.
Okay. And are you still doing your writing in the morning? Your
I'm
morning pages?
Yeah, well, you can, when we go on our walks, you can ask me whether I've been doing so. And if I haven't, then you can be like, well, how do you expect me to?
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay, because I am going to get into the habit again, as I have a writing project.
Okay.
Okay, well, yeah, that's everything at last.
Good.